Dear participants of the tour, dear colleagues, dear guests of the podium, and especially warm welcome to Dan Michman from Israel. We are coming now to the second part of our event, but first of all, I want to thank Katja Seibold for this tour through the area of the former Jewish DP camp, Bergen-Belsen, which was really exciting. Thanks so much. My name is Dagi Knellesen. I'm a historian and research associate of the Presidium of the German Historical Museum. On behalf of our president, Raphael Groß, who unfortunately can't join us today, I now welcome you warmly to our panel discussion. I also want to thank the Gedenkstätte Bergen-Belsen, namely Elke Kriglewski and the colleagues, for the wonderful cooperation. My colleague Annette Wolf from the Documentation Center, German Occupation of Europe in the Second World War, organized the whole event, what was really not so easy because this area is, as we heard, very special, but everything is now going very well. And she will introduce later the participants of the podium and moderate the discussion. And now I give it over to Elke to say hello.
Dear guests, when Professor Groß addressed me asking if we would be willing to join in the cooperation regarding this exhibition, but also the event, I was very grateful because it enables us to join in important questions that we all need to address when teaching about the Nazi crimes in nowadays. I'm very, very happy that we can be here all together. Thank you very much, Dan, for coming here. Thank you to all the colleagues of the DHM. And last but not least, of course, thank you to my colleagues who helped organizing this event. But last but not least, I would like to express my thanks to the Bundeswehr, the German army, who again showed, with the possibility of being here, their great support for our work at the memorial site. Looking forward to an interesting discussion. Thank you very much.
Yes, welcome very much to our panel discussion, Survivors and Remembrance. And just a short note at the beginning, we will have the event entirely in English, but there is German simultaneous translation, so you can get the headphones over there. And also, if you are joining us online and you see our video, I remind you that we have a German and English video. Today we are at a very unusual place, as was already mentioned, at the former displaced persons camp, Bergen-Belsen, now the Niedersachsen-Kaserne Lohheide. And we are very grateful to be here, we already had the tour over the former displaced persons camps. And now we will start with our discussion, our panel discussion, and we have 4 distinguished guests. Agata Pietraszczyk, she is the curator of our exhibition at the German Historical Museum in Berlin, the exhibition on displaying violence, in which in the accompanying program this event takes place. And we have Katja Seibold, you all here know her already. We have Dan Michman, already mentioned, from Israel, from Yad Vashem, and Elke Kriglewski. And I will introduce them in more detail to you in just a moment. First, however, let me say a few words about the idea behind today's event, which takes place, as I said, in the context of this exhibition. You also see the poster here on the picture. As part of our accompanying program, we have visited locations of the early exhibitions on Nazi crimes. So we've been to London, Paris, Liberec, Warsaw, and today we are especially grateful to be here at the former displaced persons camp, where an exhibition took place that we want to speak about today. In July 1947, the exhibition Unser Weg in der Freiheit, Our Path to Freedom, opened in the Roundhouse, just a few meters from here. It was organized mainly by Raphael Olewski from the Central Committee of the Liberated Jews in the British Zone and Zvi Horowitz from the Jewish Historical Commission in Göttingen. In May 1945, barely a month after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, Rabbi Robert S. Marcus, sent from the United States, observed among the survivors, quote, a tremendous psychological letdown and a feeling of hopelessness about the future after the short-lived joy of having been freed. If you visit our exhibition at the German Historical Museum in Berlin, and you see it here, this is the entrance site, and if you then go to the section dedicated to the 1947 DP camp exhibition, and it's a fairly large section, you can see the picture here, you will encounter something else than hopelessness and despair. Although you see a documentation of the annihilation of European Jews and of the horrors endured by those who organized the D-Camp exhibition, but you also encounter a documentation of Jewish tradition in Germany, proudly collected and presented in regional sections devoted, for example, to Göttingen, Lübeck or Bremen. And you can also see visions for the future, concrete plans for a better life. Unser Weg in der Freiheit was chosen as the exhibition's title for good reason. So, how did the organizers and all those involved get there to this forward-looking approach, given the dire circumstances of life in the DP camp and the hopelessness that was expressed by Rabbi Marcus? In our discussion today, we will look at the Bergen-Belsen DP camp and its exhibition as a kind of miniature model of how survivors dealt with their experiences in the immediate post-war period, and how this shaped our understanding of the crimes up to the present day. The history of Jewish displaced persons may at first appear somewhat marginal. However, when placed within a broader historical framework, its significance becomes evident. The historian Dandina has described the history of the DPs as a prism for understanding central developments of Jewish history itself. Because it was in the politics of the DP camps that, for the first time, especially in contrast with the minority policies of the interwar period, Jews were treated as a politically relevant collective. The famous Harrison Report from August 1945 brought about this shift. I hope we will touch on this later in the discussion, but to put it briefly, at first the DP camps were organized along national categories, and Jews were not recognized as distinct group. As a result, they were forced in camps together with Nazi perpetrators and collaborators from other countries. Only after the report of the American lawyer Earl G. Harrison to US President Truman did this change. And so the Jewish DP camp Bergen-Belsen, even though in the British zone, also reflects this shift. It was housing up to 12,000 Jewish survivors, mostly from Eastern Europe, until its closure in mid-1950. So there is a great deal of complex historical context behind the exhibition we are discussing today. And to explore this topic with us, we have 4 panelists from different fields of expertise, and I warmly invite you now to come up and take your seats. Let me briefly introduce our panelists. Katja Seibold, you all know her by now, is a historian at the Bergen-Belsen Memorial and works on the history of prisoners of war and displaced person. Agata Petraszczyk is an art historian and Alfred Landecker lecturer at the Freie Universität Berlin. She deals with the memory of the Holocaust and World War II in the visual arts and culture of the mid-20th century. And as I mentioned before, she's also the curator of our Berlin exhibition. Professor Dan Michman is head of the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem and professor emeritus of modern Jewish history at the Bar Ilan University. And Dan Michman has been involved in Yad Vashem's academic activities since the 1980s and published extensively on the historiography of the Holocaust. So we are very glad having you here today. Dr. Elke Griglewski, she's a political scientist and historian, and since 2021, managing director of the Stiftung Niedersächsische Gedenkstätten and director of the Gedenkstätte Bergen-Belsen. So thank you also for co-organizing this event with us. I'd like to begin by getting a better sense of the kind of exhibition we're talking about, organized so shortly after the war in a DP camp. So, Agata Petraszczyk, my first question goes to you. Could you tell us how you came across this exhibition during your research and what struck you most about it, or what seemed particular maybe to you compared with other exhibitions you have also studied?
Thank you. I also maybe briefly would like to begin by thanking Katja Seibold for the tour and Annette for organizing this event in this very special place. And as for the exhibition, it is indeed a very unique exhibition, a very different one, I would say, also from the ones we feature in our presentation in the German Historical Museum. And one of the most interesting things about this exhibition, and I would say also the most challenging for us, was the fact that it was so multidimensional. So normally also when we talk about exhibitions as a medium in art history, we often emphasize that exhibitions emerged from the need to categorize things. So for example, to group them, let's say paintings in a certain style and so on and so forth. So it was like a kind of device to organize certain genres, certain historical ideas. This exhibition in Bergen-Belsen completely broke those distinctions because it featured a great variety of material. On the one hand, we had huge displays showcasing craft items made in art schools, so in vocational schools for young people. On the other hand, we had artworks. There were also photographs which documented often initiatives of the survivors that led to establishment of monuments, graves. So in a way, this exhibition brought together this really eclectic type of material, which is not something that we see in other shows. And Katja Seibold wrote also beautifully about it, how it combined these aspects of looking into the past and into the future through this material. When we were walking through the roundhouse, I had in my mind very vividly the film from the exhibition, which we have the great opportunity to show in Deutsches Historisches Museum. And in this film, you can see how the audience is walking around different panels, and it's very vivid. People are really pointing at photographs, looking at newspapers, and they are talking, and there is an exchange, and there definitely is a kind of atmosphere of a debate, of a discussion, of a conversation. And this is also something that this exhibition created. It was not only simply a question of representing something, but bringing people together. It was a kind of platform for connection, and I think that also was something that was very special. So in a way, to kind of wrap up maybe your question, I would say that this multimedia and multidimensional aspect of the exhibition is what makes it very special. And it was the same aspect that made it difficult for us to maybe work with this material so that we can present a coherent message to the viewers today. But I think in a way, as we were working, we also understood that in this difficulty is in fact the power and the important message of this exhibition.
Thank you very much. Can you maybe say, just to make it a bit more clearer, who were the organizers in this DP camp, and who was the audience of this exhibition?
Yes, so as you said, the exhibition initiated from the Central Committee of Liberated Jews in Bergen-Belsen, and it was coordinated by Rafael Olewski, who was in charge of organizing this exhibition, and it brought together people from the whole of, so Jewish DPs from the whole of British occupation zone. So that's why we also have sections dedicated to specific cities like Liberec or Göttingen and so on. And apart from these geographical sections, there were also, for example, different organizations such as Joint had their own small sections, or the aforementioned Ort schools. So that's, I would say, the structure in a nutshell.
And the audience?
And the audience, I would say, was mostly the audience from within the DP camp, from within the British occupation zone. Although, as Katja mentioned in the tour, the exhibition was multilingual. Parts of it were in English, parts of it were in German. Of course, the largest amount of material were available in Yiddish. We can see an intention to bring people from the outside of that community, but we don't really have any traces that this was successful. We do, of course, see British military there also at the film, for example, looking at the exhibition.
So to understand this exhibition, I guess it is important to understand the situation the DPs lived in. So maybe, Katja, you showed us in the tour on this historical ground the history of the DP camp, but maybe you can say very briefly, in order to understand who were the organizers of the exhibition, where did they come from, what experience did they bring with them, and how were they living here?
Okay, but first I'd like to add something about the building we are now in, because I forget it. I told you during the tour, or shortly before we arrived here, that we are in the building GB3. GB stands for the German term, is an abbreviation for the German term Geschäftsbaracke. So this building was used by the Wehrmacht as an offices building, but later on, after the liberation, the American Joint Distribution Committee, the HEDC, which was active here from July 1945, used this building, for instance, to establish a search office here. So displaced persons could come and could tell, oh, my aunt, I've heard my aunt survived in place XYZ. And then they sent the information out that the person, the niece, was living here, so they could match it and meet each other afterwards. So it was very important, the task the HEDC did here, in this, exactly in this building we are now. back to your question. So maybe we have to imagine you are living next to the campsite. It's only 2 kilometers away from the former concentration camp Bergen-Belsen. Imagine living in 1942, 2 years after the liberation, still in a former Wehrmacht barracks. Imagine
1947.
1947, 2 years after the liberation, still in a barracks, not in a flat, not in a nice surrounding, still in a former Wehrmacht barracks. Imagine 2 years after the liberation. So how did it come? Because you were living in the country of the perpetrators. Yes? Imagine. And most of the survivors of Bergen-Belsen were the sole survivors of their family. So it might be that in 1947, you just built a new family. You married twice, you gave birth to a child, but you are still in the country of the perpetrators 2 years after the liberation. So on the one hand, you could say, okay, I give up. So on the other hand, you can say, I go forward, and I'm looking forward to my future. But if you are looking at marriage or pictures, photos of marriages which took place here, 2,000 people married here, or 2,000 marriages took place here from 1945 to 1950 until the dissolution of the DP camp. So, but if you are looking at those photos, you will only recognize young people. And not always they are looking lucky, but you would expect it because you are young and you got married. And so it was a dealing with life and with death because you were next to the campsite. The DPs were the first who enter the former campsite to erect buildings, to erect memorial stones, like collective ones, like the Polish non-Jewish wooden cross, or like the Jewish monument, or individual ones for those who died in Bergen-Belsen. So they erect a lot of memorial stones, and they were the first who remembered on the place. So it was horrible because on the one hand, it was maybe a good thing to be in the British occupied zone, because then you were in the direct contact with those who had the mandate about the country you like to go, to Palestine or to Israel. But the British refused, and they didn't want to open the gates of Palestine. So there was a constantly struggle between the Jewish displaced persons and the British military government here in Bergen-Belsen. So a lot of demonstration took place, and you can see on the posters, which are written in Yiddish with Hebrew letters or in English, that they are constantly fighting that they could go where they want to go, because it has a reason why more than 10,000 people in 1947 still were here in Bergen-Belsen, because they couldn't go not only not to Palestine and later on Israel, but also not to Canada, to United States, because all
not
those...
back to their homeland,
yes,
right?
Yeah, or they tried to get back to their homeland, and some went back to their homeland, but then they had to recognize that there were the sole survivors, or that, for instance, in Poland, the Soviet Union was had now the government about. So they came back here and had to wait until all those countries open their gates, open their fences, and because there were economic reasons for some countries that they said, oh no, you are not fit enough to work for us, to do something for our economy. So they refused to take them in, so to say. And the British feared when they would open the gates to Palestine that there will be conflicts between, or the conflicts between the Arabs and the Jews will rise, and so they like to refuse that, to not give so much opportunity to get so much trouble and struggle. But it was really difficult to be here as a Jewish DP in the country of the perpetrators. So that's why the exhibition is so important, because the title, Our Way to Freedom, unser Weg in die Freiheit, has a double meaning, because on the one hand it tells something about the persecution and about the way out of the persecution and to survive. On the other hand, it's also a sign to the British government to say, please, this is our way, we want to go out here from the country, and please open the gates.
So the vision of the future and the planning of the future was a major part of the entire project of the exhibition, from what I understand now. But equally important, I think, and Agatha also mentioned it already, was the documentation of the past. And we saw in these panels the history of Göttingen and Bremen and so on. So they tried to document the long and rich Jewish tradition in Germany and in these local sections. And I think it's very extraordinary because most of the people involved in the exhibition came from Eastern Europe. So it was not their tradition, but I guess they felt if they are not doing it, if they are not documenting now this tradition, this heritage will get lost. And the other thing that they documented, or where the past played a role, is the documentation of the destruction of European Jewry. And we are glad to have Professor Michmann with us, and who researched the historiography of the Holocaust extensively, and this early research especially. So I would like to ask you, what could the survivors and also the organizers of the exhibition actually know at that time about the destruction of European Jewry, and where did this knowledge come from? So what documentation of the crimes already existed, and perhaps also what interpretations or frameworks did they use to make sense of this knowledge?
Okay, so first of all, I want a personal word that it is very moving for me to be here, because my parents were in the concentration camp in Bergen-Belsen. So to come here has a special meaning for me. A second thing, Raphael Olewski was mentioned, and in the 1980s I worked a lot with his daughter Yochevet, so there's also this personal connection. Look, regarding documentation, I think it's important to emphasize, first of all, that there is a modern secular Jewish tradition that started in the beginning of the 20th century with the Kishinev program in 1903 of documenting, and in order to keep it for the future. And so you have, and well known is one of the poems of Chaim Nachman Bialik, who wrote about it. But after World War I, there were huge pogroms in Ukraine, and again, historians became involved and documented what happened. Then during the Holocaust, we have, for instance, in the Warsaw Ghetto, the well-known Oinek Shabbos archive, but also in several other places. So there is already a 20th century tradition that when there are such huge atrocities, it should be documented in order not to lose many of the details. If you do it immediately after the event, then it doesn't fall into oblivion. So that is an important aspect. And I would say there is another dimension that urged the exhibitions, but also other writings. And I found a very moving expression in what Hans Günther Adler wrote. Hans Günther Adler was from Prague. He was in Theresienstadt, and he published a study, a sociological study. He was a sociologist. A sociological study, the enormous one, was recently also translated into English after 70 years about. And 4 years later, a companion with documents. But in 1974, he published a book that was called Der verwaltete Mensch. And there is a foreword in that, which is very interesting to read. And he talks about why he wrote his book about Theresienstadt. He says, "I couldn't live further without making sense for myself what happened to me." And of course, as an academician, he wanted to do with academic tools. So so in order to understand what happened, there is an urge of documenting and also first studies during this period. In hindsight, we can say, of course, there are fresh memories, and on the other hand, there was no comprehensive view, and there was no grassroots research. So a lot of the things that afterwards entrenched themselves in the understanding of the Holocaust are the result of personal feelings. And nowadays, in many cases, we can see that they were not precise and so on, but it happens there. But what was important is that this urge to document, we find it everywhere. And it's already Philip Friedman, who was an historian in the interwar period, and was liberated in Lvov, Lemberg, in 1944. The first thing that he did was setting up an historical committee. And afterwards there were additional committees, and it accumulated later on in the JICH, in the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, which exists until today. So they started to work, and Philip Friedman wrote the first studies on what happened. And actually, you can see what a bright historian he was, because when you read them again, these studies from the end of the 1940s, the beginning of 1950s, you can see how much he knew and also understood. Unfortunately, he died at a quite early age in 1960. But for the sources, beyond the testimonies, maybe I'll give another example, which is not from the DP camps, but in Hungary. In Hungary, when survivors returned to Budapest, and they wanted to get help and aid from the community, they would be registered, and they were told to go to the other room and give a testimony. And there is a whole archive, which is an acronym is DEGOB, which was not used for many years, and we can talk about it too, but it came up. But you have it also, you have in the Netherlands, you have in the Committee for the Jewish Documentation in Paris, which actually started already in 1943 in Grenoble, where they collected testimonies and so on. So you can see it in many places that these initiatives were taken. And these are sources that come from the Jewish side. Now, on the other hand, there was a wealth of documentation from the German side. Usually what we have with archives is that you have to wait 30, 40, 50 years. In Israel, if we want to know something about the Mossad, we'll still have to wait, I think, 30 years from now. But what happened here, the Nazi regime collapsed, and documentation was there. Just to give you an idea that the Americans took documentation from the American zone in Berlin to the United States and returned it to the Bundesarchiv in the beginning of 1960s, and that was 6 cargo ships, right? That's only from their neighborhood, and the Soviets took from their zone to Moscow, and this archive was discovered in 1990. It was the Sonderarchiv, which is 3 kilometers. So, and a selection from these many documents were presented in the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. That is the end of 1945 and the beginning of 1946. So, and parts of them were presented in the press. So it was there. Then we have also first Historiebücher, that is memorial books in Poland. You have about Krakow and Żółkiew, which were published in Yiddish in 1946. Then we have the periodical, the first periodical on the Shoah that was published by survivors in the American zone, von letzten Horben, about the latest, the most recent destruction. There were films and there were pictures regarding Bergen-Belsen. Of course, there were the British ones, but there were also Soviet films. And there were, I would say, another source which is interesting, that is first literary, semi-documentary publications. A very interesting, sorry, an interesting one is by a Dutch Jew, was before the war the chairman of the Zionist Federation and was also a writer, Abel Herzberg, and he published a series of articles on which were then collected into a book, Amor Fati, about Bergen-Belsen, but focusing on types of perpetrators and also of Jews, right? Not just a general overview, historical overview, which might be boring, but it was a very lively description of people whom he encountered and with which he wanted to show human behavior in extremis, right? And explain it also to the general public who didn't understand the returning survivors, what they went through. There are a lot of stories about the Netherlands, what happened, but so there was a wealth. There was a wealth of documentation. The question was what to use, and I would finish this part by a document that you showed. That is the call for to the people in the camp to bring materials, right, from April, was it, right? Or May, from May, and there is a very interesting sentence towards the end. Please bring it in order that it will not be forgotten, right? So that is a very important drive in this will to collect materials and have it also as a representation, whether it is a book or it is an exhibition.
Mm-hmm. And we have a very similar phenomenon, I guess, not only in documentation and research, but also in the culture of remembrance already immediately after the war. And these exhibitions, I guess, they can also be described maybe as a hybrid of research and commemoration and so on. But if we shift our focus a bit to this the culture of remembrance, we notice a very similar thing, that shortly after the war, it was survivors who took the initiative. Also in the case of Bergen-Belsen, it was the survivors who inaugurated the first stone monument commemorating the Jewish victims, not far from here, on the site that is now part of the memorial, in April 1946, so long before any commemorative signs were established by the German authorities. So What role did survivors play in shaping the culture of remembrance, and how did that role maybe change over time? That would be my question to Elke Griglewski.
Yeah, I think it's a very relevant question, and I think it's also one aspect that makes this exhibition so very valuable is that both your question and both the exhibition enable the audience to see survivors in a different way that they're perceived today. Because today, survivors are perceived as people telling their story of suffering. And people tend to forget that right after 45, and for actually quite a long time, their role was completely different. And as you mentioned, and Katja already mentioned, it were the survivors who, not only in Bergen-Belsen, but also all over Germany, installed the first signs of commemoration, that they were the ones who wanted to remember, and that they also, so that means that they actively went into this process of creating a fundament of commemoration, which were, on the one hand, monuments, but not also monuments. It were also what we are discussing today, that you need knowledge. Without knowledge, without documentation, you cannot commemorate. And in the very beginning, it were exactly as Dan Michman described already very broadly, and I also wanted to focus on this, that they were the ones who created the fundament to guard the history, to save the history, to have the documentation. And it's really surprising that today most people don't know that many survivors, and you called H.G. Adler, Zvi Horowitz, Josef Wulff, Rachela Auerbach from Dringelblum or Onek Shabbat, Josef Melkmann, Leon Polyakov, I mean the list, Ruth Bondi, there are so many names of survivors who engaged as historians, who not only made exhibitions, but also created institutes, who created those institutes who exist until today. If we think of Yad Vashem, if we think of Bet Theresienstadt, if we think of other sites that are institutions that until today play a very, very important role in the so-called teaching about the Holocaust or Holocaust education. Then what is also very important, because it's also part of memory culture, is the role that survivors play in the trials as those who give witness to the history. You have systematic interviews, if you think of the interviews of the psychologist, Broder, who for a long time are forgotten and later on come back into the memory again. Also as another aspect, another piece of the puzzle was what constitutes our remembrance of culture. And up to the 1980s, I would say it were the survivors who really played a very active and very important role in the preservation of history and also in designing history. Most people don't know that if we think, for example, of the International Committee of Auschwitz, Hermann Langbein, he was a politician. These people were active political people who put their own sufferings into the background and always reflected this history in a broader political sense, on a meta level, putting it into content and offering context in order to understand what had happened. And it took until the 80s that the oral history got a broader importance, and really after Schindler's List and the Spielberg Foundation, and you know that then when people started to have these large interviews, that was, I think both is important. You know, I think it's very important to have the personal testimonies, but I think we should always be aware also that the survivors in the very beginning also thought about all the aspects that were around their personal histories. And if I would say it very briefly, without the survivors, we wouldn't have a remembrance culture.
Thank you. So Agatha, you worked on another exhibition that was also a survivors project, right? In Warsaw, and we also see it in the exhibition in Berlin. And some of the survivors now mentioned play a big role in this Warsaw exhibition, but then also the people living in the DP camp here in Bergen-Belsen, a lot of them are actually also Polish Jews who were not liberated here in the camp, but they came after 46, after the Kielce pogrom here to the DP camp. So I was wondering if, besides this maybe intellectual closeness of this idea of a survivors project and a lot of the Polish survivors that influenced a lot the early research, maybe there are also other connections between these two exhibitions, or do you see that they are two very distinct projects, maybe that aim for or had different motives?
I think, first of all, that's a very interesting question. I would rather see them as distinct exhibition because of the context and situation that they were created in. So the exhibition in Warsaw opens in 1948 when the monument to the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto is unveiled. That's a very important date and a very important anniversary, the 5th anniversary of the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, but it also happens in a very specific political context. So very soon after this anniversary, all independent Jewish organizations in Poland are delegalized because everything, the whole political life becomes centralized in the process of Stalinization of the country. And the Jewish Historical Institute, as we know, it exists until today, but in the 1950s it enters a very difficult period of its existence. And I would say this context of Jewish minority in a nation state is very different than the context of Jewish DPs here in the DP camp, because it also the exhibition comes from people who are not they don't have, they're stateless, right? So what they have is an image of a country, of a future, an idea for it, but it's not something that is the context in which they live. So that brings in a very different perspective. And when we were driving through all these military buildings, I was thinking about one panel from the exhibition when they quoted Leivik, who was a very influential Jewish Yiddish language writer who visited DP camps in 46 as a delegate of World Jewish Congress. He wrote a book afterwards, so it's a very beautiful book as well. But the panel said the DP camp is not a home. And in a way, this exhibition was a call to have a home in the future, but it was also about inhabiting this very, very difficult space. And to what you have mentioned here in terms of how the exhibition reflects the conditions of people in the DP camp and the relationship to the past, I would add the question of agency, that this was not only an exhibition of commemoration and of memory, but also an exhibition, a display of agency, of the fact that the DPs, the survivors, very quickly organized, self-organized, created institutions. As you have said, they were also politically engaged. They networked with other groups often to erect these memorials because it was not possible simply within the DP community. And all these photographs that they put on the panels of graves, of monuments, are kind of traces of this agency. And I think this was something, in a way, another temporality that we should add to our discussion is not just past and future, but also right now. What was right now for them? What was living, inhabiting these buildings and this infrastructure of the perpetrators, and filling it with with life as well and with remembrance. So I think this was something in a way very, very different than this, than the context in Poland, which was so strongly marked by the Holocaust that in a way there is no aspect of this exhibition which talks about the future. And I think that's very telling in a way.
Yeah, so even though this DP camp was close to or next to the concentration camp Bergen-Belsen, but it's not the same than in Poland, where really like the death camps were, and we have a totally different, also maybe physical understanding, living in this, being surrounded really by the Holocaust. Your father, Josef Michmann, was already mentioned as also a survivor historian, and you said that your parents both were in the concentration camp in Bergen-Belsen from February 1944 until April 1945, and then they were sent on these last trains. So when the Allied forces advanced to Bergen-Belsen in the concentration camp, the SS began evacuating the prisoners here in the concentration camp and selecting approximately 7,500 individuals, so-called exchange Jews, Austauschjuden. And they were set on a transport to Theresienstadt, and your parents, it is an incredible story, were on this the last train that in the literature you find it as the lost train, and it's a horrible, horrifying story. I guess it would take a long time, or we could speak about it a long time. I encourage you to look it up. You find a lot of literature about this lost train that was then liberated by the Red Army close to Tröbitz in Brandenburg. And your parents made it back to the Netherlands, and you were then born in 1947 in Amsterdam. And your father, then the whole family made Aliyah, and your father was a Director General of Yad Vashem, but he also testified in the Eichmann trial in 1961. And we talked already about the 80s being a shift in this, where in the more mainstream research, the Holocaust was more researched, and also the name Holocaust was used, and so on. And I guess the 60s is also marks a shift, and the Holocaust, Eichmann trial, where for the first time, like, victims could really tell their stories and testimonies. So I wonder if this experience, maybe also personal, biographical experience, shaped you, like, intellectually. Also, this idea of the Jewish perspective, the victim perspective, to integrate it in Holocaust research. Did this influence you, or how did you come? How was your way in Holocaust research?
Okay, that's a very personal question. We can talk about it a lot. And by the way, what you mentioned, that my father, that we made the Aliyah, we came to Israel in 1957 when my father was appointed as Director General of Yad Vashem. That means that I'm now the only person at Yad Vashem who is there since 1957. There's no other person. Of course, I can tell several stories also about my father's testimony at the Eichmann trial, but about my personal path, me and my wife, we have two versions of how that developed. I say it is in a way accidental, and she says it is predestined. No, because originally I was more interested in linguistics, and when I moved to, sorry, I got a cold yesterday, so, yes. And when I switched to or added history to it, I was mostly interested in the biblical period and participated in archaeological excavations in Masada and so on. That is also how I started my studies at the Hebrew U at the end in 1967, and gradually I moved to the modern period. And in the end, when I was about to finish my PhD, the position of the professor who had to teach Holocaust studies at Bar-Ilan University was open because he died in 1974. He was a survivor from Vilna, Mark Dvorzhetsky, perhaps the name is well known. So I got a position, and then I really entered Holocaust studies. I had attended 2 courses on the Holocaust before. I didn't focus on it, especially though. I had a course with Otto Dov Kulka. I assume that his name is well known, and also George Mossy, who would visit the Hebrew U each year for one semester. So I was not in the, let's say, in the path that several other Holocaust scholars in Israel went through, being students of Yehuda Bauer and Israel Gutman and so on. Nevertheless, of course, being in Israel and with an emphasis on Jewish history, and that's what I studied, the Jewish voice in history and Jews as actors, as protagonists, and not just material for the perpetrator was important from the beginning, because that is one of the things that in German historiography on the Shoah until the 1990s was very apparent that there were Jews, right? And then they deal with perpetration. I even remember having a talk with Peter Longerich, who was at Yad Vashem in 1995 for a while, and he spoke about functionalist historiography, and he said when we get to the stage of deportations and so on, then in this historiography, the Jews are deported, the Jews are murdered, the Jews are that, but there's nobody who's really doing it, right? So here and there you have names who are templates, but you don't get into the personalities. And that is something that, of course, in German historiography changed in the 1990s.
You wrote somewhere that, and I guess in historiography this is shared broadly, this thesis that only with Saul Friedlander in the 90s, this integration of the Jewish and victim perspective started. But also you mentioned Leni Yachil, and I think she's usually mentioned much less. Even her book, her monumental monography on the Shoah is only available secondhand now in Germany, right? It's like it's so I think, but maybe the two of them started with really like this integrated perspective into the perpetrator Holocaust history, also integrate the Jewish and victim perspective.
Yeah, I think I knew Leni Yachil personally very well, and I also a graduate student who wrote an MA thesis on our historiography, and this book, which she wrote, has an interesting history, because there was an exchange with Hannah Arendt. right? After when Hannah Arendt came to Israel for the Eichmann trial, she became friends with Leni Achir. And when she published Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, Leni Achir was so angry. I still want to publish an essay that she wrote as a response to it. But this was a drive for her to write more about a comprehensive study, and she was commissioned by Yad Vashem in 1972 to write this study. In Hebrew, it only came out in 1987, and in English in 1990, and then in German in 1998. So it took a long time, but she really started with integrating, let's say, the two narratives from both sides, because you had a lot of historiography, of course, on particular cases which take one side or the other, but a comprehensive history which integrates these perspectives, and especially the communal perspective. And there is a difference between Leni Achil and Saul Friedlander. Friedlander brings the individual voice, right? It has to do also with Friedlander as a person, right? He is he's an individualist, and less focusing on Jewish society as such. And Leni Achil emphasized this aspect. But maybe I'll an anecdote, which is interesting with when we're talking about testimonies. So when the Eichmann trial took place, I was 14 years old, and I wanted to see my father testifying. But in Israel, you get a personal ID only at the age of 16, and you couldn't enter the hall of the trial without an ID. But it was for the first time in Israel also broadcast via a it's a TV circuit, right, in the Ratisbon monastery. And at that time, security regulations and observance were not so exact, even though you also there had to bring your ID. So I went to the neighboring house and jumped over the fence and could get into the hall where I saw my father testifying, as it was screened there. And my father, in his testimony, has a very moving story about a child who was hidden for a long time, more than a year, in Amsterdam, and he was discovered and then sent to the Westerbork transition camp, and he was speaking only with a low voice and be very, very wary. And they said to him, "Here you can speak out loudly, and you can also walk around." It was the children's home there, and he started to run around the Appelplatz and shouting and so on, and it was very moving. And then I came home, and my father came home, and my mother said, "How could you tell this story? It happened to me, not to you." Yeah, so so that's very interesting, because it is a testimony, right? And it was true, but he internalized her story, right? So so that is something that I learned about testimonies. You have to be careful, you have to check it. Doesn't mean that it is true, but therefore I had a certain predestination or scholarly, but the path was twisted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In a way, what your anecdote is what I guess in the future will have to happen more, the witness of the witness, the testimony of the ones who testified, because they cannot do it anymore. And I wonder if memorial sites understand themselves in this way to testify for the testifier, or to prolong the possibility of telling these stories. And when we spoke about that, it only changed in the 90s, that these victim or survivor perspectives got integrated into the broader picture. I wonder what has happened since then. Did we, like Dan Michman once said, that it was only a beginning in the 90s, and then one would have needed to go on this path? Is this what happened, or where are we standing now? And also in the culture of remembrance, where are we looking back at this early research? Because what we saw in our exhibition, I guess, is that a lot of these early research and early testimonies got completely forgotten.
Yeah, well, I think we are in a very complex situation. I think there are aspects that are more or less clear, like, yes, I would say, of course, the memorial sites are the ones who should take over the responsibility, and very often are perceived as a kind of witness. On the other hand, I thought you had just an interesting discussion about the question, what created this, let's call it multi-perspective narrative, or taking into account not only the structural questions, but also the personal questions. And I think there has been a change, and a good change in Germany, is that we are having more and more perspectives involved, like the fact that the director, for example, of the House of the Wannsee Conference today is a woman with a Jewish background, with a survivor's history. I think it's something good, because she brings a different perspective than I would bring into the word, being the granddaughter of perpetrators. And the important thing is to remain into dialogue. But the fact that we are having in our society more and more different perspectives to this history, and not only like it was in the very beginning, which was the majority position, most people dealing with this history were the children or grandchildren from perpetrators, with the lack, very often, with the lack of reflection, of including, or that it was necessary to have both perspectives. And so this is, I think, one chance. I think we are still in a process in developing what can be objects, what can be documents, what can be film interviews, for example, that will help us in our work to have this important perspective. And I think exhibitions like this one will also play a big role. But one essential point is, I think, is that we have to manage to close the gap between 45 and now. Because until today, for many people, the history ends in 45, and then there's nothing. And today we are in the political situation that we are in. Yeah, that means having 51% in Germany that say it's enough now, let's not talk about this past any longer, having right-wing extremism and so on. So, and maybe there is, for me at least, coming from the educational perspective, there is one thing that is clear, and that is there is nothing that is scheme F. Yeah, for somebody it might be, this is why I think the book with the letters of your mother are so interesting. For one person it might be documents, ego documents, diaries, letters, who will be the approach in order to get in touch with this topic. For others it might be memorial sites. For the next one it might be films and so on. So I think what we need is an openness to have a big variety of historical sources and methods in order to offer spaces to get in touch with this history, and to be aware and not try to substitute, because we will not be able to substitute those who really survived and told their story themselves right after 45. It would be unfair to pretend that we can substitute it. But we have other very valuable voices, and I think, yes, I do think so, that it's our chance to speak with perspectives who have come from the following generations.
Thinking about where we stand today and the testifier of the testifier, Katja Seibold, you do a lot of these tours that you did today with us, right? And you do them to people who were born in the DP camp and their children, right? So also there, the heritage or the knowledge about that, the testimony went on in the family. And I wonder, how is their reaction seeing this, being confronted with their story, or how do they deal with this burden maybe, or heritage of the DP camp history?
At first they are surprised that so many buildings are still there. And this year, at the 80th anniversary regarding the liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, we had the opportunity to go by bus to their former birthplace. So 12 people who were born at the DP camp between 1946 and the youngest one was born in 1950. We had the opportunity to go with them to their birthplace, and they were accompanied by the children or nephews or nieces. And so it was very special to go by bus to a site which is normally not open for us civilians. So when we arrived there, and when the gates were open for us, so to say, to the former birthplace, it was a shouting, but a lucky shouting. Oh, wow! And now I realized that the stories which were told, that my father could have a look to the window to me and my brother, that's real. That was not a lie. And because then we saw the building and the windows were very deep, so next to the bottom, so the father could have a look through the windows to the mother and to the young born child. So for some, it was really a surprise to see the place, or sometimes they were before, one time or two times before there. But again, it was special for them to be there and to get a connection to their parents in a way. Even the parents are long gone, so to say, but it was for them very special. And then they also sometimes bring photos with them. And then they are shown us the photos, and then we went back with a bus to the barracks here. And before, I was searching where they were living, in which building they were living with their parents. And then we go by bus to each building here. And then I said always, let's have a look into the list. And then I said, okay, in this building was someone born, and he lived or she lived with her parents until 1948 there. And then was again loud shouting in the bus, because all were really amazed and really lucky to see the building is right still there. And so it was not only an illusion, so to say, but they were at the place where they were born and where they grew up. So this was very special.
So seeing this place, it is maybe also so shocking that it's still there and it's not alive, because it is a very, very short history, a very specific history of very little years. And as we try to see today, even though it was a very short time and very specific history, it has a major impact. And I was wondering, when it ends, so the DP camp here in Bergen-Belsen, but the story, the history of the DP camps themselves also end in the 50s, or the last in the American sector are closed 56. 57. So what is left from this story, and also what is left from the exhibition maybe, and the effort to, in this specific place, to say something about the past and the future. And before I will address this question to you about, let's say, the afterlife, not only of the DP camp, but also of this exhibition, I would like to remind you maybe that you can also think about questions. We will open up a few minutes at the end, questions from the audience. So you can prepare maybe in your head questions, and I will give this about the afterlife of the DP camp history, but also the afterlife of this exhibition, and maybe think about it and also maybe the afterlife of the early research, of the early documentation, and maybe think about it in two ways. So its objects, its material remains, and you said something about this. It's shocking that so much is still here. I think it says something fundamental about this short episode, that one is surprised that there's still so much standing, but at the same time the history itself is not remembered. The discrepancy about the rich material remnants, but the little remnants in memorial culture. So the objects, the material remains also of the exhibition, but then also the immaterial traces. So the impact of the exhibition, the impact of the early research, of the early efforts of remembrance. So maybe we start here, a very short last round.
Yes, I would like to add one aspect that we didn't speak about yet. Close to here is a small town called Celle, and actually, thanks to the DP camp inhabitants, religious life could begin in Celle again, because they started using the synagogue, they started installing Jewish religious life in Celle, and this was something, on the one hand, immaterial, but on the other hand, very material. It was very important for the question of Jewish life in Germany after 1945.
Well, regarding the early historiography, it has not entirely been lost, but one of the interesting things is that because of the enormous output of German historiography during the first decades, it overshadowed much of the Jewish historiography, and that was interesting because just again a personal impression. I told you about this course with Kulka that I had at the end of the 1960s, and he used mainly German sources and not the survivor sources. So this, and also with Israel Gutman, who came from Warsaw and so, and promoted taking testimonies and so on, but in the teaching, this was the body of research that was very much used. But they were not entirely forgotten. It is the importance in hindsight is that they were close to the events, and they give insights that are harder to get from after so many decades. But again, as I said also before, they didn't have the broad view how things have of the internal decision making in the Nazi bureaucracy, or in local situations, local collaborators, and so on, and even not from Jews from other countries. One of the interesting things is that in Jewish early historiography, it were mainly survivors from Poland who wrote the historiography. And I remember a lecture or paper by an historian of the Holocaust in Hungary, Rita Horvath, and she said that in reading some of the testimonies of Hungarian survivors in the immediate post-war period who were interviewed by Polish survivors, that the interviewers imposed the Polish situation on the Hungarian situation. So you find in the testimony things that never happened in Hungary, but somehow the interviewer interpreted what he or she heard according to what they knew from their home. And, and that is also with some of the terminology, for instance, right? So for instance, regarding ghetto, what is a ghetto? Right. Exactly, is a ghetto. So our impression is shaped by the Polish cases, right? But there were so many different cases, and I also remember once Israel, in one of our discussions, that Israel Gutmann was talking about the Theresienstadt ghetto. He said, that was not a real ghetto, right? Yeah, so it's not like Warsaw, right? So you have here things that you find in the early historiography that you have to be critical about. But the importance is that they gave really first insights and the sensitivities that over the years we sometimes have lost.
I think maybe I should answer this question by inviting everyone to come and see our exhibition in Berlin, to see what remained of the exhibition in Bergen-Belsen, and just maybe to say that it is really exhibition about exhibitions might sound like a kind of complicated idea, but in this particular case, I really think it was very important that we could create a situation where, you know, we can be kind of a belated audience to something. And of course, the exhibition in Bergen-Belsen closed decades ago, but we can still in a way revisit it through these traces that were preserved in the archives and think about all these threads that we discussed. And I think that is very, very, very valuable.
Yeah, and regarding the question, what is left by the DP, so to say, in the world? So when they were immigrating to the different countries, when it was allowed to immigrate, they built up there in the 1950s, for instance, in the United States, the World Federation of Bergen-Belsen Associations, and also in Israel, one of the largest Bergen-Belsen survivor organizations, the Igun Charitat. And the interesting fact is that the World Federation of Bergen-Belsen Association was led by Josef Rosensaft, the leader of the Jewish Committee and the Central Jewish Committee of the liberated Jews in the British zone, and that the Igun Charitat was led by Raphael Levski, one of the curators of the exhibition. So both associations are still there, so now in Israel, the Igun Charitat is led by the son of Raphael Levski, Ari Olevsky, and before it was led by Yocheved Ritz Olevsky. She died, unfortunately, in the beginning of last year. And the World Federation of Bergen-Belsen Association in the United States is now led by Menachem Rosensaft. He was born, he's the son of Josef Rosensaft and Hadassah Bimko Rosensaft, and he was born here in the DP camp like Yochi. So there is something left. And also in Bergen-Belsen at the campsite, We have the memorial stones, we have the Jewish monument. This is also something they left for the future and for the remembrance.
Thank you. Maybe
Add something?
maybe shortly so that we
Yeah,
can
no, I
also-
just wanted that there is one one diaspora which is hardly mentioned and is still quite forgotten, and that is there was a very considerable group of survivors in Argentina, and they published in Yiddish a lot of the first version of Elie Wiesel's Night was in Yiddish, published in 1956 there, and you have a whole library of first descriptions. So, and you know, South America is out of the scope of many people, so they don't pay attention. But I think it's a very important representation of the survivor community and what they produced in these first years.
So, are there questions from the audience? Maybe you like to ask something, to bring something up. If not, Elke, you you have the chance to make your remark.
No, my remark was only that I wanted to tranquilize Dan Michman, because we cooperate very close with the Jewish community, both in Buenos Aires, and in November we are going to open an exhibition in the Jewish community in Santiago de Chile, so we are aware of these Latin American Jewish communities.
So thank you everyone for joining us in this discussion. I hope that we could shed some light on a very short time, a very specific time, and a very specific exhibition, an effort of survivors in the DB camp, and we tried to entangle a bit its history and also its impact, not only the immediate impact, but also what it meant, these early voices, and what they mean for us today, and maybe also what we can see and understand better if we look at this very early engagements. So thank you all very much. We have one last event in our series, and that will be in Berlin on 8th of October. The whole series is online, so I welcome you to join us for our concluding event on the question of European memory, 8th of October. Thank you and good night.